So once there is the onset of menstruation, what are the effects or what are the changes that take place? As mentioned earlier on, you will have both the brain and the ovaries being involved in this process. Okay, so let's take it a bit slower at this junction. So we have got both the brains and ovaries involved in the hormone secretion. Okay, so at the onset of menstruation, the moment menstruation takes place, for example, it occurs today, what happens is you have got the anterior pituitary gland. Okay, so the anterior pituitary gland is located in the brain itself, which is why the brain is being involved. Okay, so this anterior pituitary gland produces what we call the follicle stimulating hormone. So as the name suggests, this particular hormone stimulates the growth of follicles, which is what you see here. Okay, so you can see that the follicles increase in size until it becomes a matured follicle. So during this period of time, there is an increase in the concentration of FSH being produced. Okay, so once the maturation of the graphene follicles occurs and we have got the production of the ovum itself, that will lead them to produce estrogen. Okay, so now this is where estrogen comes into play, which is part of the ovaries. Okay, so we have got FSH now and we have got estrogen now. So next part is the slightly confusing part for some students, which is that the moment estrogen is being produced, what estrogen does is that it does two things. So the first thing that it does is that it will help to grow and repair the uterine lining. Okay, let's take a step back and look at what had happened so far. So today is day 1 of menstruation. There is an increase in the concentration of FSH, resulting in the slow maturation of another follicle. So once day 14 hits, the follicles have fully matured and there will be the production of the ovum. So the ovum itself is now producing estrogen, and the estrogen is helping to repair the uterine lining that has been shed during the menstruation period. Okay, at high estrogen levels, what estrogen does is that it will also inhibit FSH. So meaning to say FSH is no longer being produced, and usually we represent this negative feedback with a negative sign. So the reason why it inhibits FSH is so that it can prevent another follicle from maturation, which means that the purpose of estrogen is to prevent the maturation of another ovulation from taking place. Okay, now once estrogen reaches at peak levels, what happens? We have got estrogen stimulating the pituitary gland. So pituitary gland is also part of the brain, similarly to just now whereby we looked at the FSH that is being secreted by the anterior pituitary gland. So what is the purpose of my luteinizing hormone? Okay, so luteinizing hormone, as you see in your notes, it causes the ovulation to take place, and more importantly, it helps to form the corpus luteum. So as we can see over here, okay, so once ovulation has taken place, you will have the formation of a corpus luteum. Okay, so you have the formation of the corpus luteum. So what is the purpose of the corpus luteum? Is that it produces progesterone. Okay, so progesterone main component or main importance is to maintain the uterine lining. So during this period of time from day 11 to day 17, that is the peak period for fertilization to take place, as the sperm itself can stay in the female reproductive organ for up to 3 days. Alright, so if let's say the sperm enters on day 11 and ovulation takes place on day 14, there is still a high possibility of fertilization to take place. So in the event of fertilization, the fertilized egg itself has to implant itself into the uterine lining and for fetus development, which is why the uterine lining will take place. I mean, the uterine lining has to taken to prepare itself. Okay, so once progesterone is being secreted, it will inhibit both FSH and LH. Okay, so recall FSH was initially inhibited by estrogen. Okay, so once FSH is inhibited by estrogen, that will prevent a second ovulation from taking place. Okay, so at the same time, it will also inhibit LH. So the main purpose of LH is to cause ovulation. So now the body is doubly sure that there will be no second ovulation that will be taking place. Okay, so if there is fertilization, of course eventually the corpus luteum will not be allowed to degrade until the fetus is prepared to secrete another hormone on its own. However, if there is no fertilization taking place, the corpus luteum will degrade, and once the corpus luteum degrade, progesterone levels decrease, and you have got shedding of the uterine lining taking place, and that will be menstruation. So once menstruation onset, you will have the same process that take place again, whereby FSH is being produced once more. Okay, so when we look at the diagram here, that is exactly what is being mentioned. So you don't have to care too much about GnRH. This is not part of your syllabus. All right, so anterior pituitary gland is the main one that we are looking at. So anterior pituitary gland will produce FSH, which stimulates the growth of my growing follicle. Okay, so the growing follicle along with ovulation results in the production of estrogen. So estrogen itself will inhibit FSH. Understand? Okay, so at the same time, estrogen, what it does is that it will stimulate luteinizing hormone. So the purpose of the luteinizing hormone is two things. One is to stimulate ovulation. Second is to stimulate the growth of the corpus luteum. Okay, so once we have got corpus luteum, there will be production of progesterone. So progesterone production will lead to the inhibition of both my FSH and my LH. Okay, we do not have to worry about this segment here where it links back to the hypothalamus, because this part is not part of the syllabus itself. Alright, so now let's look at the table that we saw earlier on. Okay, since we are clearer on this area now. Okay, so this is the overview that we have here. What you can see here at the bottom, you have got the menstrual cycle in which the uterine lining is being shed, so that's why it is decreasing. Alright, so the uterine lining will then start to repair itself over at this junction and will be maintained throughout in the event of fertilization. If there is no fertilization, the uterine lining will then be shed. Okay, so let's look at the first hormone, FSH, that we spoke about. So once we have got menstruation that is taking place on the very first day of the menstruation cycle, we can see the FSH, the one in the black bold color, is starting to increase itself. Okay, and this is by the pituitary gland. Okay. So once the FSH has started to increase, you can concurrently see that the follicles are being developed, which is why this is called the follicular phase. Alright, so over at day 14, when I have got sufficient amount of FSH, while estrogen is starting to increase, at the peak of estrogen and at the peak of the LH, there will be production of my ovum. Okay, so once the ovum is being produced, now you have got the corpus luteum that is starting to form. So the formation of the corpus luteum will inhibit both FSH and LH. So meaning to say that corpus luteum production, which produces my progesterone levels, will inhibit both my FSH and my LH levels. Okay, so the purpose of the corpus luteum, the progesterone, is to maintain my uterine lining. As you can see here, it is being maintained, and if there is no fertilization taking place, the corpus luteum is being degraded here, which will lead to a fall or a drop in progesterone level, which will then coincide with the drop in the uterine lining wall, which means menstruation has taken place again. Okay, so you might have to review the menstrual cycle and the 4 hormones involved a couple of times if it is not clear enough for the first round of the video, because it is indeed confusing if you are going through it the first time.